Now I'll finally have the house all to myself, my daughter-in-law whispered to her friends at my son's funeral, and in that quiet moment inside St. Andrew's Church, something inside me turned cold and still. I hadn't meant to overhear her. I was standing near the back of the sanctuary, beside the tall stained glass window Daniel used to admire when he was a boy. The winter light filtered through the colored glass and spilled across the wooden floor in soft patches of blue and gold. The church smelled faintly of lilies and polished oak, the same scent that had filled the air during so many Sunday mornings when Daniel was young and would sit beside me swinging his feet because they couldn't reach the floor. Now those same pews were filled with people dressed in dark coats and quiet expressions, their voices hushed out of respect for the occasion. My son's photograph rested on an easel near the altar, framed by white flowers. Daniel was smiling in that picture, the same gentle smile he'd had since childhood, the one that always made strangers trust him immediately. I had chosen that photograph myself the night before the funeral. I remember staring at it for a long time on the dining room table, wondering how a life could be reduced to a single image surrounded by candles. The service had ended only a few minutes earlier, and people were slowly filing out of the church, stopping to shake my hand or offer brief words of sympathy. I nodded politely, thanking them the way a person is expected to do in moments like this. After a while, the crowd thinned, and the quiet grew deeper. That was when I stepped toward the side hallway to collect my coat. I wasn't trying to listen to anyone. But Olivia's voice carried clearly through the half-open door of the small reception room. She was standing with two women I recognized from her book club, their black coats draped over their arms. Her voice was lower than usual, but not low enough. "Now I'll finally have the house all to myself," she said with a soft laugh that didn't sound anything like grief. One of her friends murmured something I couldn't hear. Olivia responded quickly, almost impatiently. "Well, of course she can't stay there forever. It's too big for one person anyway." My fingers tightened around the strap of my purse. For a moment I wondered if I had misunderstood her. Perhaps I had heard the words wrong. Grief can do strange things to a person's hearing. But then she spoke again, and this time her voice was even clearer. "Daniel always said the house would be mine eventually." The hallway seemed to grow colder around me. My son had been buried less than an hour ago. Outside the church doors, the February wind rattled the bare branches of the maple trees lining the street. Yet inside that quiet hallway, Olivia was already speaking about ownership, about space, about what would belong to her now that Daniel was gone. I didn't walk into the room. I didn't interrupt her conversation. Instead I stood perfectly still beside the window, watching the pale light slide slowly across the stone floor. My mind drifted back to a memory from many years earlier, when Daniel was 12 and insisted on helping me paint the porch railing on our house. He had gotten more paint on his sneakers than on the wood, and he'd laughed so hard he nearly dropped the brush. "Mom," he said back then, "this house is going to stay in the family forever." I remember smiling at him and telling him houses don't last forever, but families do. Standing in that church hallway decades later, I realized how naive that belief had been. Olivia's friends eventually left the room first, their heels tapping lightly against the tile floor as they walked toward the exit. Olivia followed a few moments later. Her face had changed completely. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, her expression drawn and solemn. Anyone seeing her now would have believed she was a grieving widow doing her best to remain strong. When she noticed me near the window, she gave a small, tired smile. "Margaret," she said softly, stepping closer, "are you ready to go?" I studied her face for a moment. Her eyes were red, but I couldn't tell whether it was from tears or simply the cold winter air. "Yes," I said calmly. "I'm ready." She reached for her coat and slipped it on slowly. "Daniel would have wanted us to take care of each other," she said. I nodded without answering. Outside, the wind had grown stronger, sweeping across the church parking lot in restless gusts. Several people were already starting their cars, the engines rumbling softly in the distance. As Olivia walked ahead of me toward the front doors, I looked once more at Daniel's photograph near the altar. For a long moment I stood there in silence. Then I turned away and followed her outside into the cold afternoon, carrying with me the quiet knowledge that the funeral had not been the end of something. It had only been the beginning. The drive home from the church took 15 minutes, but that afternoon it felt much longer. The sky above our small town in Pennsylvania had turned a dull gray, the kind of winter sky that seemed to press down on the rooftops and quiet the streets. Olivia drove because she insisted she should, and I sat in the passenger seat with my hands folded in my lap, staring out the window at the familiar roads Daniel had driven since he was 16. We passed the grocery store where he used to buy ice cream every Friday night when he was in high school. We passed the gas station where he worked part-time during college. Everything looked exactly the same as it had a week ago, before the phone call that changed everything. Olivia kept both hands on the steering wheel, her posture straight and careful. She had always driven that way, as if she were being evaluated by an invisible instructor. For most of the ride she said nothing, and I was grateful for the silence. The heater hummed softly, pushing warm air through the vents while the cold wind rattled against the windows. I watched the bare branches of the oak trees slide past as we turned onto Maple Ridge Road, the quiet neighborhood where Daniel had grown up. Our house stood at the end of the street just as it always had, a 2-story white colonial with a wide front porch and dark green shutters. Daniel had painted those shutters himself one summer when he was in college. He said the old color looked tired and the house deserved something fresh. Olivia slowed the car and pulled into the driveway. For a moment neither of us moved. The house looked larger than usual, perhaps because Daniel was no longer there to fill it with his presence. I could almost imagine him stepping out the front door, brushing snow off the porch railing the way he did every winter morning before work. Olivia turned off the engine and finally spoke. Her voice was gentle, almost rehearsed. She said, "Margaret, the house feels so empty without him." I nodded slowly and reached for the door handle. The wind hit my face the moment I stepped outside, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Olivia walked ahead of me toward the front door, her heels clicking against the driveway. When we stepped inside the house, the quiet wrapped around us immediately. The living room still held the arrangement of chairs where friends and relatives had gathered 2 nights earlier after the funeral planning meeting. Someone had placed a casserole dish on the kitchen counter, wrapped carefully in aluminum foil. The clock on the wall ticked steadily above the doorway, measuring time the same way it had for more than 20 years. Olivia hung her coat neatly on the rack by the door and then turned toward me with a small sigh. She said, "I know today has been exhausting for you. I think it might be a good idea if we start talking about the future soon." Her words were soft but deliberate, like someone placing pieces on a chessboard. I looked at her for a moment before answering. "The future can wait a little while, Olivia. Today has been long enough already." She nodded, but I noticed the quick flicker of impatience in her eyes before she turned toward the kitchen. I walked slowly through the living room and into the hallway that led to Daniel's old bedroom. The door was half open. Inside, the room looked exactly the way he had left it during his last visit before he and Olivia moved into their own house across town 5 years ago. The baseball glove still rested on the top shelf of the closet. The faded poster of the Philadelphia Eagles still hung crookedly above the desk. I stepped inside and ran my fingers lightly across the surface of the desk where Daniel used to finish his homework late at night. For a moment I allowed myself to remember the sound of his voice calling from the kitchen asking if there were any cookies left in the jar. Then Olivia's voice carried down the hallway from the kitchen. "Margaret," she said, "I was thinking about something earlier today." Her tone had changed slightly. It was more practical now, less gentle. She continued speaking before I could answer. "This house is really very large for one person. There are 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms and a whole yard to take care of. It must be exhausting to manage all of that alone." I stood quietly in Daniel's old room, listening. Olivia continued talking, her voice drifting down the hallway. "There are some very nice senior communities nearby. Comfortable places where everything is taken care of. Maintenance, meals, transportation. It might be something worth considering." I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the words she had whispered to her friends at the church only an hour earlier. Now I will finally have the house all to myself. When I stepped back into the hallway, Olivia was leaning casually against the kitchen counter with her arms crossed. She gave me a sympathetic smile as if she were offering helpful advice rather than laying the first stone in a careful plan. I walked past her without raising my voice and poured myself a glass of water from the sink. The cold water tasted sharp and clean after the long afternoon. Olivia watched me closely. After a moment she said softly, "Daniel always wanted what was best for everyone." I took a slow sip of water and set the glass down beside the sink. Then I looked at her and answered in a calm voice that surprised even me. "Yes, Olivia. My son always believed in taking care of his family." And for the first time since the funeral began, I started to wonder exactly how well Daniel had prepared for what might come next. That evening the house settled into a silence that felt deeper than anything I had experienced before. The old clock in the hallway continued its steady ticking, but without Daniel's voice or footsteps the sound seemed louder, almost echoing through the rooms. Olivia remained in the kitchen for a long time, moving dishes from the counter to the sink and opening cabinets with careful, deliberate motions. From the living room I could hear the quiet clink of plates and the running water from the faucet. I sat in the armchair beside the window where Daniel used to sit during winter evenings when he came to visit. He liked that spot because the lamp beside it cast a warm circle of light that made the room feel calm and safe. Outside, the street was almost empty. A thin layer of snow from the morning still covered the lawns along Maple Ridge Road, glowing faintly under the porch light. I folded my hands together and allowed my thoughts to drift back through the years. Daniel had always been thoughtful, even as a child. When he was 9 years old he once insisted on saving his allowance for 3 months so he could buy me a small music box he saw in a shop downtown. He wrapped it himself using newspaper and tape because he did not want to wait for the store clerk to do it. I still kept that music box in the drawer of the hallway table. The memory made me smile for a moment, but then the words I had overheard in the church returned to my mind with quiet clarity. "Now I will finally have the house all to myself." The sentence repeated itself slowly, like the ticking of the clock. After a while Olivia entered the living room carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to me and sat on the couch across from the chair where I was sitting. The steam rose gently from the mug, carrying the faint scent of chamomile. Olivia looked tired, but her eyes were alert in a way that suggested she was thinking carefully about what to say next. "Margaret," she said softly, "I know today has been difficult for both of us. Daniel meant everything to me." I nodded once and thanked her for the tea. She continued speaking, choosing her words slowly as if she had rehearsed them earlier in the day. "Life is going to look different now. We both have to think about how to move forward." Her tone remained calm and sympathetic, but there was a firmness underneath it that reminded me of the conversation we had just hours earlier in the kitchen. I took a small sip of the tea before answering. "Moving forward takes time." Olivia leaned slightly forward with her hands clasped together. "Of course," she said quickly. "I just mean we should start thinking about practical things eventually. Bills, maintenance, the future of the house." The word house lingered in the air between us. I set the mug down carefully on the small table beside my chair. "The house has been part of this family for 32 years, I said quietly. Daniel learned to ride his bicycle in the driveway. He planted the maple tree in the backyard when he was 10. Olivia gave a polite nod, but I could see that the details did not carry the same weight for her. She looked toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms and then back at me. "It is a beautiful home," she admitted. "That is exactly why it might be better used by someone who can truly manage it." Her voice remained gentle, but the direction of the conversation was unmistakable. I studied her face for a moment and noticed how quickly she had shifted from sympathy to practicality. Earlier that afternoon she had spoken about senior communities as if the idea had simply occurred to her. Now the suggestion sounded more like a carefully considered plan. I did not argue with her. Instead I asked a simple question. "Did Daniel ever talk with you about the future of the house?" Olivia paused for a moment before answering. "He always said we would figure things out together." The answer was vague, but the hesitation before she spoke told me more than the words themselves. I leaned back in the chair and looked toward the hallway where the old photographs of Daniel still hung along the wall. In one picture he was standing beside his first bicycle, grinning proudly with his helmet tilted sideways. In another he was wearing his graduation cap and holding his diploma. Daniel had never been careless with his responsibilities. Even as an adult he believed strongly in preparing for the future. I remembered a conversation we had nearly 2 years earlier during a quiet Sunday afternoon on the porch. Daniel had mentioned that he was reviewing some paperwork with a lawyer. At the time I had not asked many questions because I trusted him completely. Now that memory returned to me with new importance. Olivia continued speaking about property taxes and maintenance costs, but her words drifted past me like distant noise. My thoughts remained fixed on that conversation Daniel and I had shared on the porch. When Olivia finally finished her explanation she looked at me expectantly, waiting for some kind of response. I lifted my eyes from the photographs on the wall and met her gaze calmly. Daniel always believed in planning ahead, I said. Olivia smiled politely and nodded, assuming the comment supported her argument. But inside my mind a quiet realization had begun to form, growing slowly and steadily like the first light before sunrise. If my son had truly prepared for the future the way I remembered, then somewhere in this quiet house there might already be an answer waiting to be discovered. That night the house remained unusually quiet long after Olivia had gone upstairs. The heater hummed softly through the vents, and the wind outside brushed against the siding with a faint restless sound. I stayed in the living room for a long time, sitting in the same chair beside the window where Daniel used to sit during winter evenings. The mug of tea on the table beside me had gone cold, but I did not notice until I picked it up and felt the chill of the porcelain against my fingers. Olivia's footsteps had faded an hour earlier when she climbed the stairs to the guest bedroom she had chosen for the night. I could hear faint movement once or twice, drawers opening and closing, but eventually even those sounds stopped. The house settled into the kind of silence that only comes after midnight. I stood slowly and walked toward the hallway. The photographs along the wall caught the soft glow of the lamp from the living room. Daniel's life was displayed there in quiet pieces of time. His first school picture with his hair combed too carefully. His high school graduation portrait. A photograph of him and Olivia standing together on the porch the day they announced their engagement. I paused for a moment in front of that last picture. Daniel looked proud and hopeful. Olivia's smile was bright and confident. At the time I had believed the two of them were building something strong together. Now that memory felt different, as if the photograph belonged to another life entirely. I continued down the hallway toward the small office at the back of the house. The door was slightly open, just the way Daniel used to leave it whenever he visited and needed a quiet place to work. The room smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish. A wooden desk stood beneath the window, the same desk Daniel had used during college when he came home during the summers. I switched on the small desk lamp, and a warm circle of light spread across the surface. For a moment I simply stood there looking at the drawers. Daniel had always been careful with his documents. Even as a teenager he kept his papers organized in labeled folders. When he bought his first car he placed every receipt in a small envelope and wrote the date on the front in neat handwriting. That habit had never changed. I pulled open the top drawer of the desk. Inside were several old notebooks, a few envelopes, and a stack of letters from years earlier. Most of them were ordinary things. Holiday cards. Old bank statements. Receipts from a home repair Daniel had helped me with 3 summers ago. I closed the drawer and opened the one beneath it. This drawer held thicker folders arranged carefully from left to right. Property taxes. Insurance papers. Utility bills. Each folder was labeled in Daniel's familiar handwriting. My eyes moved slowly across the row until they stopped on one envelope that looked different from the rest. It was larger and made of heavier paper, sealed neatly along the top edge. Across the front Daniel had written a single word in blue ink. Mom. The room felt very still as I picked up the envelope. The paper was smooth and slightly stiff beneath my fingers. Daniel must have placed it there intentionally. The thought sent a quiet ripple of understanding through my chest. My son had always believed in planning ahead. I remembered that conversation on the porch nearly 2 years earlier when he mentioned meeting with a lawyer. At the time he had spoken casually about reviewing some documents and organizing things properly for the future. I had not asked for details because Daniel had always been responsible. Now the envelope in my hand suggested that his preparations might have been more thoughtful than I realized. I sat down slowly in the chair at the desk and studied the handwriting again. Mom. Just that one word. No explanation. No instructions. The house creaked softly somewhere behind me as the wind shifted outside. For a moment I hesitated, not because I was afraid of what might be inside, but because opening it felt like stepping across a line between the life I had known and whatever waited beyond this quiet night. Finally I slid my finger carefully beneath the edge of the seal and opened the envelope. Inside were several folded pages and a smaller document clipped neatly to the back. I unfolded the first sheet of paper. Daniel's handwriting filled the page in steady lines, clear and deliberate. My dear Mom, the letter began. If you are reading this, then it means something has happened and I am not there to explain things in person. I paused and took a slow breath before continuing. Daniel's words moved calmly across the page as if he were speaking directly to me from the other side of the quiet room. He wrote about responsibility and family and the importance of protecting the people you love. Then one sentence near the middle of the page made my heart beat a little faster. I have arranged certain legal protections for the house and the property, he wrote, because I wanted to make sure that you would always have a place here no matter what circumstances might change. I lowered the letter slightly and stared at the desk in silence. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard shifted softly as Olivia moved in the guest bedroom. The sound reminded me of the conversation in the kitchen earlier that evening. Senior communities. Practical decisions. The future of the house. Slowly I looked back down at the letter in my hands. Daniel had always been thoughtful. But as I read the rest of his careful handwriting, I began to realize that my son might have been far more prepared for the future than anyone else in this house had imagined. The desk lamp cast a steady pool of light across the paper as I continued reading Daniel's letter. His handwriting had always been calm and measured, each word placed carefully as if he understood the weight language could carry. The first page spoke about responsibility and family, the kind of things Daniel believed in deeply. But the next lines held something more deliberate, something that made the quiet office feel suddenly different. I shifted slightly in the wooden chair and read the next paragraph more slowly. Daniel wrote that during the past 2 years he had taken steps to organize certain legal matters concerning the house and the property. He explained that he wanted to make sure the home where he had grown up would remain safe for me no matter what circumstances might arise. The sentence was simple, but it carried a clarity that settled firmly in my mind. Daniel had not written those words casually. He had planned them. My eyes moved to the smaller document clipped behind the letter. The paper was thicker than the letter pages, printed with formal language and the letterhead of a law office in Philadelphia. At the top of the page were the words Property Trust Agreement. Beneath that title were several paragraphs written in precise legal terms. I read each line carefully, following the language the way Daniel must have done when he first reviewed the document with his attorney. The trust described the ownership structure of the house on Maple Ridge Road. It stated clearly that the property was to remain under a protected trust administered through a legal arrangement Daniel had established 2 years earlier. The trustee named in the document was a law firm called Hale and Whitman. The primary beneficiary listed in the agreement was Margaret Dawson. My name. I sat still for several seconds after reading that line. The quiet hum of the heater filled the room again as the meaning slowly settled into place. Daniel had not simply written a thoughtful letter. He had built a legal safeguard. The document explained that the property could not be sold, transferred, or altered without the consent of the trustee and the primary beneficiary. The wording was clear and deliberate. Any attempt to change ownership would require legal review and direct authorization from the trust administrator. I turned the page slowly and continued reading. Near the bottom of the document another name appeared. Olivia Dawson was listed as a secondary beneficiary with limited residential privileges under specific conditions. The wording described that she could reside in the property if mutually agreed upon by the trustee and the primary beneficiary. However, the document also stated that the final authority regarding residency remained with the primary beneficiary. Again my name appeared in careful printed letters. Margaret Dawson. A quiet understanding moved through me like the slow arrival of morning light. Daniel had anticipated the possibility that circumstances might change after his lifetime. He had not explained his concerns in the letter directly, but the structure of the trust revealed his thinking clearly. The house would remain protected. The decision about its future would not belong to anyone acting alone. I set the document gently on the desk and looked again at the first page of Daniel's letter. The next lines felt more personal than the legal language I had just read. Daniel wrote that he hoped the document would never become necessary, but he believed in preparing for every possibility. He explained that people sometimes reveal their true priorities during moments of stress or loss, and he wanted to make sure that his mother would always have security regardless of how those moments unfolded. I leaned back slowly in the chair and looked toward the window beside the desk. Outside the night had grown darker. Snowflakes drifted quietly through the beam of the porch light, turning slowly in the winter air. Upstairs a floorboard creaked softly as Olivia moved in the guest room again. The sound was faint, but it reminded me of the conversation earlier in the kitchen. The careful sympathy in her voice. The suggestion about senior communities. The quiet emphasis on the future of the house. I looked back down at Daniel's letter and read the final lines once more. He wrote that the house had always been a place of safety and belonging for him, and he wanted it to remain that way for me. If anyone ever suggested otherwise, he wrote, the trust would speak more clearly than he could. I folded the letter slowly and placed it back on the desk beside the legal document. The room felt calmer now, as if the uncertainty that had followed me home from the church had finally begun to settle into something clearer. Daniel had understood more than I realized. He had prepared more carefully than anyone else in this house could have guessed. For a long moment I remained seated in the quiet office, listening to the soft rhythm of the heater and the distant whisper of snow against the windows. Then I gathered the papers, placed them carefully back into the envelope marked Mom, and closed the desk drawer with gentle precision. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new assumptions, and perhaps new plans from Olivia. But tonight, in the stillness of that small office, I understood something important. My son had not left the future of this house to chance. And because of that quiet preparation, the conversation about what would happen next had already changed in ways Olivia had not yet begun to imagine. Morning arrived slowly over Maple Ridge Road, bringing a pale winter light through the kitchen windows. I woke earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had remained alert long after midnight. The envelope Daniel had left for me rested inside the desk drawer in the office, but its contents remained clear in my thoughts. The trust agreement. The careful language. The quiet assurance that the house would remain protected. I moved through the kitchen quietly, filling the kettle with water and placing it on the stove. Outside, a thin layer of snow covered the backyard. The maple tree Daniel planted when he was 10 stood motionless in the cold morning air, its branches outlined by frost. A few minutes later footsteps sounded on the stairs behind me. Olivia entered the kitchen wearing a soft gray sweater and holding her phone in one hand. She gave me a polite smile, the same composed expression she had worn the evening before. "Good morning, Margaret," she said. "I hope you were able to rest." I nodded slightly and poured hot water into 2 cups. "I slept enough," I replied. She sat at the kitchen table and glanced around the room as if studying the familiar surroundings with a new perspective. For a moment neither of us spoke. The quiet between us felt different now, less uncertain. Finally Olivia set her phone on the table and folded her hands together. "Margaret," she began gently, "I was thinking about what we talked about yesterday. I believe it might be wise for us to start discussing some practical steps soon." I carried the cups of tea to the table and placed one in front of her before sitting down across from her. "What kind of steps, Olivia?" she continued carefully. "Things like the long-term plan for the house. Maintenance costs are increasing every year. Property taxes alone have gone up nearly 15% in the past 5 years." She spoke with the calm tone of someone presenting reasonable facts. "Many people your age," she continued, "choose to move into communities where everything is easier to manage. It would allow you to relax without worrying about repairs or yard work." I listened quietly while she spoke. Her voice was measured and sympathetic, but the direction of the conversation was unmistakable. I remembered the words I had overheard at the church only the day before. Now I will finally have the house all to myself. When she finished speaking, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for an answer. I took a small sip of tea before responding. Daniel believed strongly in planning ahead, I said calmly. Olivia nodded quickly as if my statement supported her argument. Exactly, she said. That is why we should start making arrangements before things become difficult. I set the cup down gently on the table and met her gaze. Daniel did make arrangements, I said. Her expression shifted slightly, a brief flicker of curiosity passing across her face. What do you mean? She asked. I stood slowly and walked to the hallway leading toward the office. Olivia remained seated at the table, watching me with growing attention. After a moment I returned carrying the large envelope Daniel had left in the desk drawer. I placed it carefully on the kitchen table between us. Daniel prepared certain documents 2 years ago, I explained. He wanted to make sure the house would remain secure for the family. Olivia's eyes moved quickly to the envelope. Her posture straightened slightly. She reached toward it but stopped herself halfway, as if unsure whether she should open it. What kind of documents? She asked. I slid the trust agreement across the table toward her. Legal protections, I replied. She picked up the paper and began reading the first page. At first her expression remained neutral, but as her eyes moved further down the document the calm confidence in her face began to fade. The kitchen remained quiet except for the faint sound of the heater turning on again. Olivia turned the page slowly and read the next section. I watched the change in her posture as she reached the paragraph that listed the beneficiary. Her eyes paused there for a moment longer than the rest of the page. Finally she looked up at me. I did not know about this, she said carefully. Daniel and his lawyer arranged everything through a trust, one replied. The house remains protected under that agreement. Olivia placed the document back on the table and folded her hands together again, though the calm assurance she carried earlier had softened into something more uncertain. She glanced toward the hallway and then back at me. So the house cannot simply be sold, she said. Not without the trustees' approval and the beneficiaries' consent, I answered. The words were not spoken with anger. They did not need to be. Olivia looked at the document once more before pushing it gently back toward me across the table. For a few seconds she said nothing at all. Outside the kitchen window the snow continued to drift slowly from the branches of the maple tree. Finally Olivia leaned back in her chair and exhaled quietly. I see, she said. I lifted the envelope and returned the papers inside before standing from the table. Daniel always believed in protecting the people he loved, I said calmly. And it seems he prepared very carefully to do exactly that. The kitchen remained quiet for several minutes after Olivia finished speaking. She stayed seated at the table, her hands folded loosely in front of her, but the calm confidence she had shown earlier that morning was no longer there. The document Daniel had prepared still rested between us, and the weight of its meaning seemed to settle slowly across the room. I gathered the papers and placed them back inside the envelope, then set it gently beside my cup of tea. Olivia watched the movement carefully, her eyes following every motion as if she were trying to measure what it meant for the future she had already imagined. Outside the window the winter sky had brightened slightly, though the air remained cold and still. A few neighbors passed along Maple Ridge Road, their cars moving slowly through the thin snow left from the night before. Life in the neighborhood continued quietly, unaware that something important inside this house had already shifted. Olivia finally leaned forward again and cleared her throat softly. I suppose Daniel never mentioned this arrangement to me, she said. Her tone was controlled, but there was a slight tension beneath the words. I looked at her calmly before answering. Daniel did not discuss every detail of his planning with anyone, I said. He believed that preparation should speak for itself when the time came. Olivia nodded once, though her eyes drifted briefly toward the hallway as if searching for some other explanation hidden within the walls of the house. The silence stretched between us again. Then she spoke once more. I understand that the house is protected, she said slowly. But perhaps we can still discuss what would be best for everyone involved. Her voice carried the same careful reasoning she had used the previous day. After all, she continued, the property requires upkeep. There are taxes, maintenance costs, and long-term considerations. She paused for a moment before adding another sentence. It might still make sense to consider selling in the future if everyone agreed. I listened to her quietly. The words were familiar, though the tone had changed slightly now that the trust agreement was on the table. Yesterday the suggestion had been presented as helpful advice. Today it sounded more like negotiation. I folded my hands together on the table and looked at her steadily. Daniel placed the house in a trust for a reason, I said. The document explains that clearly. Olivia exhaled softly and glanced down at the envelope again. I know, she replied. I just believe that Daniel would want everyone to move forward peacefully. I considered that statement for a moment. My son had indeed valued peace within the family, but he had also valued responsibility and honesty. The two ideas were not always the same thing. Olivia pushed her chair back slightly and stood from the table, walking slowly toward the kitchen window. She looked out across the backyard where the maple tree stood tall in the winter light. Daniel loved that tree, she said quietly. He planted it when he was still in elementary school. I nodded. Yes, he did. She turned back toward me after a moment. I never expected things to become complicated, she admitted. I stood from the table as well and carried my cup to the sink. Life often becomes complicated when people begin making assumptions, I replied gently. The faucet ran briefly as I rinsed the cup and placed it beside the other dishes. When I turned around, Olivia was still standing near the window, her expression thoughtful now rather than confident. The shift in the conversation had clearly unsettled the plans she had imagined. But I also noticed something else in her expression. She was thinking carefully again, adjusting her understanding of the situation piece by piece. Finally she returned to the table and picked up her phone. I will need some time to consider everything, she said quietly. Of course, I answered. Important matters deserve careful thought. Olivia slipped the phone into her pocket and walked slowly toward the hallway. Before leaving the kitchen she paused and looked back at the envelope resting on the table. Daniel planned further ahead than I realized, she said. I met her gaze calmly. My son always believed that preparation was a form of protection, I replied. Olivia nodded once more and then continued down the hallway toward the guest room. A few moments later I heard the door close softly. The house grew quiet again, but the silence felt different now. The uncertainty that had filled the rooms after the funeral had begun to clear. Daniel's voice was no longer only a memory in photographs and letters. His careful planning had become part of the present, shaping the future of this home in ways that no one could easily ignore. I walked slowly into the living room and looked out the front window toward Maple Ridge Road. The snow along the sidewalks had begun to melt slightly under the weak winter sun. Children from the house across the street were building a small snowman beside their driveway, their laughter drifting faintly through the cold air. For the first time since the funeral, the weight in my chest felt lighter. Daniel had prepared for more than I had understood. And because of that quiet preparation, the future of this house was no longer uncertain. It was simply waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The following days passed quietly inside the house on Maple Ridge Road, but the quiet carried a new kind of awareness. Olivia and I moved through the same rooms with careful politeness, speaking when necessary but leaving long stretches of silence between our conversations. The trust document had not ended the discussion about the house, but it had changed the balance of it. That change could be felt in the smallest moments. Olivia spent more time on her phone now, stepping outside to take calls or sitting near the living room window while scrolling through messages with a focused expression. I did not ask who she was speaking with. Instead, I continued my normal routines, making breakfast in the morning, watering the plants in the sunroom, and walking slowly through the backyard each afternoon to check the garden beds Daniel and I had built together years earlier. Winter still held the town in a cold grip, but the sunlight grew a little brighter each day. One afternoon Olivia entered the kitchen while I was organizing a stack of mail on the counter. She paused near the table and watched me for a moment before speaking. Margaret, she said. I contacted a real estate agent earlier today just to ask a few questions. I looked up calmly. And what did the agent say? I asked. She hesitated slightly before answering. He explained that houses in this neighborhood have increased in value considerably over the past 5 years. According to him, this property could sell for nearly $600,000 in the current market. Her voice carried the careful tone of someone presenting useful information rather than a proposal. I placed the envelopes neatly back into their stack and met her gaze. That may be true, I replied. Olivia nodded quickly. Exactly, she said. Which is why it might be wise to keep our options open. Even if the trust requires certain approvals, we could still discuss the possibility with the trustee eventually. I walked slowly to the sink and rinsed my hands before turning back toward the table. Daniel structured the trust very clearly, I said. The trustee must consider the intent of the agreement before approving any sale. Olivia leaned against the counter, her arms crossed loosely. Yes, she said, but trustees often rely on the wishes of the family when making decisions. If both of us agreed, it could make the process easier. The conversation was calm, but the direction of it had become unmistakable. Olivia was searching for a path around the boundaries Daniel had placed in the documents. I did not raise my voice or argue. Instead, I reached into the drawer beside the refrigerator and removed a small notebook Daniel used to keep household records. I opened it slowly and placed it on the table. Daniel wrote detailed notes about the house for years, I explained. Repairs, improvements, landscaping plans. Olivia glanced down at the pages, her eyes moving across Daniel's familiar handwriting. The backyard deck he built 8 years ago. The new roof installed 3 winters ago. The insulation upgrade that lowered the heating costs by nearly 20%. Daniel cared deeply about maintaining this home, I continued. He believed it should remain a place where family could always return. Olivia listened without interrupting, though her expression revealed quiet calculation rather than nostalgia. Finally, she closed the notebook gently and pushed it back toward me. I understand that the house meant a great deal to him, she said. But circumstances change. People move forward. I studied her face carefully before answering. Daniel understood that as well, I replied. That is exactly why he prepared the trust. The room fell silent again. Outside the kitchen window, a light breeze moved through the branches of the maple tree, scattering a few remaining patches of snow from the limbs. Olivia looked toward the yard for several seconds before speaking again. Have you contacted the trustee yet? She asked. Not yet, I said. But I intend to do so soon. She nodded slowly, absorbing the answer. Perhaps that would be helpful, she said. It would allow everyone to understand the options clearly. I closed the notebook and returned it to the drawer. Then I turned to face her fully. Daniel trusted the trustee to protect his intentions, I said calmly. That is why the arrangement exists. Olivia said nothing in response. Instead, she picked up her phone again and glanced at the screen before slipping it back into her pocket. I will be stepping out for a few hours, she said. I have some things to think about. Of course, I replied. She put on her coat and walked toward the front door. When the door closed behind her, the house returned to its familiar quiet once more. I stood at the kitchen window watching as her car backed out of the driveway and disappeared down Maple Ridge Road. The sunlight reflected faintly off the melting snow along the sidewalks. In that quiet moment, I realized something important. Olivia had begun searching for ways around the protection Daniel had created. But she had also revealed something else without realizing it. My son's preparations had not only protected the house. They had revealed exactly who was willing to respect the meaning behind it and who was not. And that understanding would soon shape what happened next.